Mrs. Warren.
Remember, we don't have to do it alone.
I don't know where we're gonna fly like you did sometimes. Seeing eyes of mine. Love, 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 I wanna be strong, strong. We're doing wrong, 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 but I'll try to fix it. Love, 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 I wanna be strong, strong. We're doing wrong, 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 but I'll change it, change it. Seeing eyes of mine, you see, there are no trees inside of me. In this desert, I can look at you with love. Seeing all that I can long. Can you stay and I will grow? Grow the hanging gardens of Babylon. Love, 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 I wanna be strong, strong, strong. We're doing wrong, 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 but I'll fix it, fix it. Love, 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 I wanna be strong, strong, strong. We're doing wrong, 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 but I'll change it, change it.
Not only are we not educated about what it means to be mentally ill or what it means to have someone in their family who has a mental illness, including addiction, but professionals aren't, teachers aren't, even doctors, even our physicians don't know what it is and therefore what they're looking at. But what this teacher should have said to me, one of the things we know about addiction itself is that the earlier a person tries drugs, the more likely they will suffer addiction. And so when you have a child who's 12 years old who's smoking marijuana, it is a warning sign. It is a sign that there is the potential, in fact, there is a greater odds that that person will suffer addiction than someone else. What that teacher, if he'd been educated, would have said to me is, let's stop and look at what it means that there is a 12-year-old child who already is getting high. What's going on in his life? What is he experiencing? One of the things, we have this idea that kids use drugs because it's fun, because they want to be high, because of peer pressure. That's probably the reason most people think. They go to a party, they don't want to be uncool. So, if someone's passing around a joint, they'll take it. If someone's handing out beers, they'll take it. Sometimes with other drugs as well, harder drugs, they'll take it. What we know from research, talking to kids themselves, talking to teenagers all around the country, we've done a group, talked to 7,000 teenagers, to talk to them about why they use drugs themselves, if they do, or else what their impression is about why their friends do, why other people do. And the answer was not because it's fun. The answer was not because of peer pressure. They wanted to be cool. The answer was because of stress. So the question that we ask about a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, why are they using drugs? Is it just for fun? Or are they dealing with, or trying to deal with, or trying to medicate themselves for something else that's going on? In Nick's case, eventually, after many, many years of struggling to figure out what was going on with him as his drug use continued, and his drug use escalated to the point that it was life-threatening, and in fact, my son almost died many times. We became very, very close to losing him. And what that conversation should have been about was not why he was, the conversation had to be partly about drugs because drugs were killing him, but the bigger question, or the question that would have helped him so that his use did not escalate to the point that it did, was why was he using drugs? Therefore, what were the stresses that he was under? And what it turned out, after 10 treatment centers, many, many outpatient programs, several overdoses where I got calls from emergency room doctors to say, Mr. Chef, you'd better come down here. We have your son. We don't know if he's going to make it. Versions of that. One time a doctor calling me and telling me that, again, my son was in the emergency room. They thought they were going to have to amputate his arm because it had become infected because he was shooting drugs. Luckily, of course, he didn't. But after that, we finally took him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist, after meeting with Nick for a while, said to me and my wife, we have to figure out why this child is using drugs. If we don't, he's going to kill himself. He's going to die. So I want to do some psychological testing. Before she said that, she said, could I see the psychological testing that he's had in the past? And I went psychological testing. We'd never heard of it. No one had ever mentioned it. And the doctor said, you mean that he has seen various therapists and he's been in treatment programs for addiction, for drug use, and no one has had him tested? And of course, no one had even mentioned it to me. She tested Nick. It turned out, as I said, that he has bipolar disorder. He has very serious bipolar disorder. Once they figured that out, that was about 11 years ago, Nick went into treatment for bipolar disorder, and it turned out he also has a mood disorder, very serious depression as well. He's been in therapy since then. He's been on psychiatric medications. Not only has he remained clean now for 11 years, he celebrated his 11-year anniversary yesterday. But it goes back to what the doctor said to me. His life didn't just get back to being something that was manageable, but he has the life that I, as a parent, as any of us would want for our children, which is a life that's filled with challenges, of course. He has mental illness, he has to manage it. Sometimes he gets depressed, but who doesn't? But at the same time, he has this fabulous life. He's got relationships that he never thought he could have, and we never thought he could have. He's married. He married someone who he met at school about a couple miles from here when he was a teenager, way before, when he was 12, middle schooler. He's moved up from Los Angeles and he lives out in West Marin. His biggest joy, or I shouldn't say his biggest, but maybe his wife wouldn't like me to say this, but are his dogs. And so he goes on these various dog walks, and because he lives near us, we get to go together, and we go on walks together, and we go surfing together. And to see him healed, people always ask me when they're in the throes of this, if you were in the throes of this, is hell. I don't know what to tell you about. And part of the reason it's hell is that, first of all, we don't know if the person we love will survive. And the other thing is this other nagging question, which is even if they do survive, can they be okay? Can they have a life? Will they always be struggling? And again, Nick struggles, but he struggles in a way. He's on medication. He's learned about his mental illnesses so that he can manage them. If he recognizes the fact that he's going down, feeling bad, feeling the anxiety that comes with mental illness like bipolar disorder, or going into a dark depression, he knows what to do. First of all, he does things like he might go on a run, or he might go surfing. I mean, he knows how to take care of himself. Self-care can be important. But the other thing he knows about is to call his doctor. And sometimes, then if you're sick, what do you do if you or someone you love has cancer? God forbid. They treat it. You're feeling better. Cancer's gone into remission. A year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, it comes back. Go back to the doctor. Treat it again with mental illness, with mental health. It's the same thing. So Nick does that, and this big, this profound message of Nick's experience, my experience, is that when there's life, there's hope. And we can say it to them as our heart breaks for you, and it's a tragedy, and tragedies happen. When people are struggling, and when there is life, there is still hope. And there were times when I, in my brain, prepared for the next phone call, prepared for the sheriff to show up at the front door and to tell me that my son didn't make it. And I had rehearsed that many, many, many times. And I rehearsed burying my son. The fact that 11 years later he is doing well and he has his full life and he has a family that he loves and that he has these connections in his life, and he loves his work. It, I hope, provides hope for people who don't think it can get better, because it can. So do not give up. Part of the reason, again, goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that why it's such an isolating and lonely experience, and why people misunderstand, and why people judge, and why people who have addiction or have various kinds of mental illnesses, bipolar disorder, depression, anxiety, who suffer traumas, who whatever it is that makes their life harder, that increases the stress, that makes it more likely that someone's going to use drugs and become addicted, or even if they don't use drugs and become addicted, their life is going to be challenging. Again, because nobody wants to experience that, and because we as a culture look at people in that situation and we blame them and we shame them, we think it's their fault and they think they should just snap out of it, and all of those things, the guilt, the shame, it makes everything worse, because first of all, that experience, it's, again, somebody who has suffering feels bad already. To be judged that it's your fault makes it infinitely worse. And if you're using drugs to cope with stress in life, and if you are being made to feel bad about yourself when you already feel bad about yourself, no wonder a lot of people take more drugs in order to feel better, in order to survive, in order to cope. And that's what a lot of it is about, is trying to cope. Kelly mentioned that when Nick started to do better, it wasn't his last time of relapsing, it wasn't his last crisis related to his bipolar disorder. The doctor diagnosed him, put him on medication, he's in therapy, as I said, but there were crises after that. It's not easy. It took a long time for them to figure out what kinds of treatments actually he needed. Mental illness, it's not like something where you go in and you take a blood test and it tells, the physician what to do. It's figure it out. It's complicated. It's complicated because things like bipolar disorder or depression, they're big, big categories, and there's a spectrum, and oftentimes they blend in together. What's the difference between someone's experiencing the low depressive side of bipolar disorder and has depression, or experiencing the sort of crazy anxiety that Nick would experience, that comes also with the other pole of bipolar disorder? And what's the difference between that and anxiety? It's hard to figure it out. In medication, it can take a long time to figure it out, and people get frustrated because they want instant fixes. It's not that easy. But the first step is recognizing the problem, accepting the problem. And if someone has mental illness, the kinds of compassion that they require involves their family and the people around them, to understand that it's not their fault. And so I will tell you that the biggest breakthrough in our experience in our family's life, and I think Nick would tell you this too, is I went from that person who was incredibly judgmental. I thought I had this crazy, this crazy, selfish kid who didn't care what his behaviors, what he did. He didn't care what it did to his family, his little brother and sister, Daisy and Jasper, or my wife Karen, his stepmom, me, or his mom, Vicky. I felt he must be this selfish kid. What happened to my son? This went on for years. Not uncommon for somebody who becomes addicted. Nick did incredibly reprehensible things that were just, they were beyond my comprehension and my understanding. This lovely child, this person that I thought I knew, broke into our home. He stole from me. He took my credit cards. He broke into he loved his little brother, Jasper. He worshipped him, and it was Jasper worship his big brother, Nick. Jasper came in one day when Nick was in his active addiction. He'd broken into the house, and Jasper had a little piggy bank that had broken, and Nick had taken his money. And Jasper, this little tiny child at that point, came in and said, "I think Nick took my money." And he did. Nick looks back and is horrified. But the actions are the result illness. It's so hard to comprehend that behavior, sometimes with incredibly terrible consequences, that behavior could be caused by illness. But it also makes perfect sense because there's two things going on. One of them is, how do we know what to do? How do we know how to behave? How do we know to treat people well, to treat people with respect, to treat ourselves with respect? Well, it's our consciousness, our brains are what's telling us how to do that. If you have a mental illness like Nick had, your brain is not telling you what it would happen if it was not ill. So what happened in Nick's case, what happens in the case of someone who becomes addicted, is that his drug use, used to bury his bipolar disorder and his depression, ends up having an incredibly damaging, toxic impact on the brain. Drugs are toxic. And the brain becomes, the presence of a drug, in Nick's case it was methamphetamine, the presence of the drug becomes the normal, the new normal. So the way that Nick has described it, and I've heard other people describe it in various ways, is that if you are addicted to a drug, if somebody withholds that drug, if you cannot get access to that drug, you feel like somebody else does, like people who are not addicted would feel if we are put in a room and there's no oxygen. We need oxygen to survive, and we will do whatever it can. We will claw and scream and steal, whatever it takes to get more oxygen, and that's what it feels like. That's what the experiencing is for somebody who's addicted, who needs more methamphetamine in order to feel that they will not die, because that is the way that they feel. So the behaviors around that, breaking into a home, we broke into our friend's home one day. We'd been gone for a couple of days, and we came home, and we were looking around, and it was clear that something was off. And it was Jasper once again. His poor little brother is the one who suffered a lot of the impact of this, because he's people who have families that are experiencing addiction know that it's a classic thing that there's one person in the family who's seeing things with clarity and is trying to take care of everybody and is really worried. Jasper said, I think Nick broke in. So I had a locksmith come to change the locks on our door, and the locksmith said to me, if you had break-ins, and the heartbreaking truth is what I said. I said, it's my son. And he looked at me like it was pathetic. It was so pathetic. But we did. We changed the locks on our door. It's another reason that we judge people who have addiction and mental illness. They are not thinking clearly. They can't. They can't, because that's the part of them that is sick. And so behaviors that we judge as unconscionable are part of the disease. And there is a thing that we hear a lot in the addiction world, which is that, I heard it over and over again, and anyone who's experiencing addiction in their family or themselves have heard this over and over again. Somebody who has addiction cannot get well until they hit bottom. They have to go so low that they are desperate to get well, and basically almost literally crawl into treatment to beg to get well. It is such a dangerous message, in my opinion. When we know that somebody is sick, we do not want them to get worse. We do not want them to hit bottom. We want to hold them. We want to pick them up. We want to get them help as soon as we can. And yet, this message continues over and over again, because we know that addiction is treatable. We know that mental illness is treatable. We want to help as soon as we can. And the problem then, of course, goes back to the cycle I'm describing, because if we don't treat someone when they have a mental illness, we don't treat them early, it gets worse. There often is this behavior that sometimes is illegal. They alienate the people around them. They scare the people around them. Sometimes they get arrested. All of those things isolate them more and make their lives harder. And so it makes their lives harder. Their addiction or their mental illness is not being treated. And in fact, it's not only not being treated, but it gets worse. So the behavior gets worse. And it's a cycle over and over and over again. We need to change the paradigm so that we recognize that addiction and mental illnesses are diseases. We want to get on them the second we can, just like if we thought somebody we loved had the possibility of a heart problem, cancer, before it gets worse. And that goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning. Why isn't that happening? And how will we make that happen? And I will tell you that the way that we are going to make that happen is by being here today together. We have to talk about this. We have to educate people. We have to help and support one another. We need people to understand how prevalent mental illness is. There was just some research of a survey that told us that in the last year and a half, again, I go back to this thing, what causes people to use drugs? We know it's complicated, but we know that a major factor is stress. We've lived under enormous stress, extra stress over the last year and a half since the COVID epidemic hit. Drug use is higher, overdose is higher than it's ever been, suicide rates are higher than they've ever been, stress has increased. It has increased, so that the point that now, this new research says that 1 out of every 3 people over the last year have experienced some, I forgot the word they use, diagnosable mental illness, including addiction, including depression. We need to understand that if 1 out of 3 people, think of the families. That's almost every family that in some ways is being touched by mental illness. And yet, we don't know that because we don't talk about it. So we need to be here. And the fact that all of you here today is the beginning of a change. And next year, there should be twice as many people here. And the year after that, there should be twice as many, more and more and more people. And the way that that's going to happen is by being here, by having this conversation. Kelly mentioned that there were, in the things she read that I had said or written at some point, that, so Nick was doing better after a while. Finally, I'm a journalist, so I went to write what our experience was about, because I wanted people to know this can't happen to your family. We need to talk about it. It's an illness, so that we need to talk about it just like we would with any other illnesses. Don't ignore the signs that a child, don't assume that a child who's isolated and appears to be depressed, it's just lowercase depression, because again, everybody gets depressed. Kids have to learn what it feels like to be sad, but don't make that assumption. Get some professional help. Figure out what's going on. And so Nick was doing better, and I wanted to write this story, and I did, and that was sort of the first time I understood how prevalent this is, because I heard from people, thousands and thousands of people, and over the years, I don't know how many tens of thousands of people, and their stories were very much the same as ours. Variations, of course, on the theme, but most of these people, or many of these people who reached out, said that they were suffering the same way that our family suffered for year after year after year, and nobody knew. They were writing to me, to a stranger, because they read some other family story and could relate. So the letters came to me, and they often began the same, which is, our family is your family, your story is our family. And no one knows. Daisy, my daughter, we were, Kelly had mentioned, that she mentioned the movie that then eventually, so I wrote this article, it became a book, and then the book became a movie. And we were at a party for the opening of the movie, which is weird. It was a very strange and scary experience, and we were unsure if we wanted to go forward to expose our family to that kind of scrutiny and all that kind of stuff, but it became a pretty clear decision because of a way to communicate the fact that we aren't alone, and the message came through because there were more letters and more people came forward to talk about their own experience, and we were at an event that was opening the movie. No, I'm not. This isn't right. Around the time the movie was opening, Daisy, my daughter, went to an art opening. Daisy's an artist, so she went to an art opening, and she was in San Francisco, and it was downtown, and she was really intimidated because she was super young and kind of shy, and she's in this room with a lot of her heroes, some of the big artists around and gallery people and all that stuff. And Daisy found herself standing in a circle of people talking, and in that circle were a couple of, you know, her idols, and they were talking, and one of them said in this circle, oh God, I went to the movies last night, I saw this movie, and it was really this hard story to watch about this family that was dealing with addiction, and the movie was called Beautiful Boy. And someone else said, God, I saw that movie too, and it was hard to watch, and I related, and whatever, over and over again. And Daisy's sitting there thinking, you know, should I say something that, you know, it's my family that they're talking about? And she didn't. But the conversation kept going about details about the movie, and this happened, and Daisy's sitting there thinking, well, it's too weird not to say anything. And so Daisy said, that's my family. That's our story. And everybody sort of stopped and looked at her. And then the big artist, the one that she was the most, you know, sort of enamored of, said, I know, it's my story too. It's our family's story too. And then someone else in that circle said, yeah, it's my story too. It's our family's story too. And Daisy's going, no, it really is our family. But the point there is that this is everywhere. It is almost impossible to find a family who does not relate to some sort of mental illness in their family, addiction, alcoholism. The kinds of stories I've heard from people as a result of the movie and as a result of the book are, you know, our experience is your experience, and sometimes it is the experience of my son from his perspective, which means they are people who themselves have been addicted, or they've experienced substance use disorders, and they have them, or have bipolar disorder, or many other mental illnesses or psychiatric conditions, or the family. And I guess the last thing I'll say is to talk about the family. It is terrifying to have somebody you love be ill. It is terrifying to have someone you love be on a course that could lead, that could lead to them not surviving or to some other devastating consequences. A permanent debilitation, a jail, a prison, and of course, death. It is terrifying. When this happened to us, because of the shame, and I was ashamed, I thought, not only did I not talk about it until I went forward to decide to write about it, but I didn't talk about it because I didn't want people to judge Nick. I didn't want them to think about him as the drug addict in our community. I didn't want people to judge me. You know, I must be a terrible father if my son was a drug addict. It's a huge word that is always, is always used, and is one that I hope that we can retire, because it makes people feel that that's what they are, and that's not what they are. They're people that happen to have addiction, or their child has addiction or substance use disorder. But in the meantime, that's what. So I didn't talk about it. Finally, in the meantime, Nick did go into treatments, and in the treatment centers there were often family groups, and we would go to family groups, and they would talk about, and the counselors would tell us to go to Al-Anon, go to therapy, go to groups of families, go to parent groups, whatever it was. And my feeling was that I would not be caught dead in a group like that, where people are sitting around and whining and drinking bad coffee in the church basement and all this kind of stuff. But finally, things got so bad that I went, and when I walked into that room, I felt, this is where I need to be. I just burst into tears, and I felt like I was home, because everybody there understood what I was going through, because they had gone through it too. As we've gone forward to understand what the suffering that families endure, and the judgment we experience, and the isolation that we feel, what I ended up learning was that just like the person who's ill needs support and needs help, we do. Whether we're parents, whether we're partners, husbands, wives, children, whether friends, we need support. We need to know that we aren't alone. And when we have support, not only It doesn't solve the problem, but there is enormous relief, and it does solve some of the problem because of the stress around addiction and around mental illness. Part of it is that we are isolated, and it makes it worse. So when we know that we're not alone, there is enormous relief. And the other thing is we can support each other, and we can help one another decide course of action. Nearby, I think we live in a world that is about this very sad, I think, message that we have to do it alone, that we don't talk about our suffering, especially if it relates. It's not unusual, I think, for somebody, if you live on this is, when I was a kid, there were people on our street who would get sick, and our next door neighbor, the mom had cancer. Everybody in the community rallied. They would bring casseroles and offer to help, offer to go to the grocery store. People with mental illness in their families don't get casseroles. But when we start talking about this, and when people understand that this is not a choice, there is no judgment around mental illness, then we will support each other with casseroles. But what happens is this culture that we live in, we pretend that we are always in control. We always have to present ourselves as if we're doing great. I remember when Daisy and Jasper were little, and Karen and I would go support them. We'd sit in the sidelines. They were on a swim team, and we would go, cheer them on. I would be sitting, in the bleachers with other parents, when the other parents were all talking about, which college, this was by high school, they were talking about, which colleges the kids were going to go to, and they would talk about their amazing performances at, at Shakespeare or concerts or soccer, elite soccer thing, and cheering on the kids as they were swimming. And I would be sitting on that bleacher, and I would be dying. I would be dying because on the outside I was cheering with everybody else, but on the inside I didn't know where my son was, and I didn't know if he was alive, and I didn't know if the next phone call I was going to get tell me that he didn't survive. When my book came out, this is not an exaggeration. Every single other parent who was sitting on that booth, on those bleachers at the swim meet, at different times over the course of a few years, contacted me. At Daisy and Jasper school, mom grabbed me with her, long fingernails. They sort of dragged me to the side, over and over again. I grew up with an alcoholic father, and it has devastated me, and I'm terrified that my son, who's 7, is smoking pot. I don't know what to do. It wasn't just about addiction, it wasn't just about drug use, but a dad came up to me, a father came up to me, and he burst into tears when he told me that he had told everybody else at his child's school that she was doing a special, program in another school, instead of telling the truth, which was that his daughter was in treatment for an eating disorder. The dad was confessing that to me as if it was one of the worst things that he could ever say out loud, and he was in tears, and I thought, how sad is it that this man who's already dealing with the terrifying illness of a daughter has to feel shame and has to pretend that everything is okay. And near us, we have this amazing writer living near us, Annie Lamont, and Annie says that we increase our pain because we always compare our insides with other people's outsides. We think that everybody else is sailing through, that their lives are going great, their kids are doing great, and the truth is, no one sails through. Life is hard. And when we're open about whatever it is we're suffering, we can support one another, we can help each other through the hard times and the good times, and we can know that we aren't alone. Thank you for being here. As I say, this last year has been confusing because of COVID, and of course we can't underestimate the impact of that. It has been devastating. But before COVID and after COVID, we are dealing with this other crisis. We are still losing. In fact, over the last year, we went up, over the last year and a half, we went from losing about 190 to 200 people every single day to drug overdose. Now it's almost 250 people a day in this country that we're losing to drug overdose. We cannot, even as we focus on this other crisis, we cannot forget the mental health crisis. We cannot forget the support that we need to give one another, the fact that we can't just sit back and hope that things will change. We have to lobby our legislators so that there is money for treatment, money for prevention, that insurance is forced to step up and pay for addiction like it pays for any other disease. There are laws that say that that's supposed to happen, but it's not. And we can do it, and we are starting. And the reason that we're starting is, look around here, look around in each other's faces, and this is where it begins. So thank you for having me, and thank you for being here.